come out on a night like this. I don't know whether you'd prefer I just talk to my friend and house partner in Ojai, Crotona, Virginia Hanson, whose name is probably familiar to many of you. We share a home there. And she tells me that Ojai is having a most unusual heat wave. And in Fahrenheit, it was 110 yesterday, which is most unusual. So I don't know what you prefer. Anyway, we were
high in the mountains.
Yes. So it really was hot. Yeah. So anyway, it's nice to be here, and I think you're all very brave. I didn't tell you last night that tonight I'm going to make you do some of the work. But since you're here, I'm sure you don't want to swim home right away, so you'll stay and endure it through. Last evening I mentioned a book whose title suddenly went out of my mind, and I apologize for that. So in order to get it correct tonight, and for the record at least, hoping that anyone who looks at the whole series of these 3 talks will then pick up the fact that there has been a correction. I was referring to the work by Matthew Fox, who is a Dominican scholar and director of the Institute in Culture and Creation Spirituality at Holy Names College in Oakland, California. What really has excited me about the book, which is really called Original Blessing, is the correct title, and I didn't give that correct title last night. It's called A Primer in Creation Spirituality. What really excited me about it was the fact that he opens with 2 very pertinent questions. And although we're going on tonight to look at Theosophy as philosophy, and which may seem, much more compatible to our whole system, but I think we have to look at the metaphysical, philosophical dimension of Theosophy, just as we looked at the religious dimension last night. So to continue a bit with our program last evening, the questions which he poses are, first of all, in our quest for wisdom and survival, does the human race require a new religious paradigm? And then he suggests, naturally the answer is inherent in the second question, does the creation-centered spiritual tradition offer such a paradigm? And what he means by the creation-centered spiritual tradition is that tradition which is really non-dualistic, which is a constant creativity taking place, that creation is always a possibility, that we're always engaged in it. And he contrasts it indeed with the tradition which really took over in Christianity, for example, following St. Augustine, and which he calls the fall redemption, in which sin becomes a major factor, always reminding me of the story of the child attending Sunday school, in which the Sunday school teacher had spent a great deal of time discussing forgiveness of sin, and that whatever we do, God, or at least Jesus, as an intermediary, will forgive us. And finally, at the end, to make certain the students, her children, had understood the lesson, she said then, now what is it, children, that we must do to obtain forgiveness of sin? Expecting, of course, the answer that we must repent, we must be contrite, we must, of course, acknowledge our sins. And finally, a little youngster in the last row held up his hand and he said, please, ma'am, first we must sin.
Very good.
And that has become the dominant theme in Christianity. Now, there are counterparts, I might say, in the other religious traditions, Hinduism, in the major religious traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Islam, and so on. There are counterparts in which later interpretations overshadowed often the original teaching. And this, of course, is where Theosophy, in its religious dimension, proposes that we need to return, as it were, to our origins. And for Matthew Fox, he speaks then of this creation spirituality with 4 paths. And I think they're rather interesting paths. The first is that we befriend creation. That is, that there is a via positiva, the positive way, the way of affirmation. And it's rather interesting. He suggests, therefore, that the Godhead, and of course he refers a great deal to Meister Eckhart, the great mystic, you see, as well as to other great mystics in this tradition, Hildegard of Bingen and many, many others, St. Francis and so on. He uses a term which should be familiar to anyone who is familiar with the key to Theosophy. You remember HPB was asked whether Theosophy is pantheism. You remember that? The inquirer saying, well, if you think that, you see, the divine is in everything, aren't you just pantheists? And she said, no, rather we are panentheists. And he uses that very same word. In fact, that is one of the themes in the book, is panentheism. Now, this is really not often found in the Christian tradition today. And so it is, in one sense, harking back to the original Christianity, which, of course, was what HPB was proposing also, and later writers. And the insertion of that little Greek word en in the pan and then theism, panentheism, God is in everything and everything is in God. So it's not that all is God, everything is God, but that the reality, the ultimate reality, and this leads us directly, of course, into the philosophical position that ultimate reality is in everything. But that does not mean that everything is ultimate reality. But everything is rooted in that ultimate reality. And so we need to look at that. There's very much more, but since tonight I want to move on to the philosophy, the philosophical aspects, I'm not going to pursue this other than to suggest that at least there are some Christian thinkers, just as there are some thinkers in the other great religious traditions, who are moving very close. I might just perhaps mention that the second path is the via negativa, that we have to befriend darkness, as he calls it, that we may have to make friends of the shadow side of life, that we have to see that this is not a dichotomy, but a dialectic that has to be carried on. And then we're able to befriend our own divinity, he says, and therefore befriend our creativity, that we are essentially creative. This is very much what I meant by suggesting that man is the chief test object, as I often put it, that we befriend our own creativity, which he calls the via creativa, the creative way. And then, out of that, we celebrate. Life then becomes a celebration, or the fourth path he calls the via transformativa, the transformative way in which we befriend the new creation, or we befriend celebration. And of course that, he suggests, is what has been lost from the Christian tradition very much. So I highly recommend it as a work that I think is certainly a seminal work, and I think we have to be very careful. Occasionally I hear theosophists, perfectly good theosophists in every way, I mean, they're dues paying, and so on, theosophists saying that, well, we'll have nothing to do with Christianity. HPB was very anti-Christian. She wasn't. She wasn't at all. I think that's quite a misunderstanding. She was anti-churchianity. She was anti the abuses of the priestcraft and the abuses of those who were sort of taking from the masses and masses of people and withholding the real teaching, the real understanding, the real knowledge. After all, she wrote commentaries on the Gospel according to John and so on, and many other things. So it was not anti-Christian, and I think we have to be careful. There was once I think it was Matthew Arnold at the end of the last century, of course the very well-known English writer, who, with tongue-in-cheek perhaps, defined the Theosophist and said the Theosophist is one who takes all the religions of the world, mixes them together, subtracts his own, and adopts the rest. And all too often that is precisely what has happened, you know. We feel that because we perhaps have not found within the church structure the authentic answers to our questions, that then we do indeed throw out the baby with the bathwater. And we feel that, well, there it is in Hinduism, there it is in Buddhism, and so on. And I think that we have an obligation to recognize that there is indeed in every great religion, all the great religions, including Christianity, the same essential truths. I always was amused and interested in the years that I was in India, and indeed touring in India as an officer of the society, lecturing for the various groups around India, that there would be a first of all, there'd be a feeling that that because they knew Hinduism, the members might know Hinduism, they were studying the Bhagavad Gita, that therefore they knew Theosophy. And I said, you know only one little corner of it that you have come to through your study of Hinduism. And very often, therefore, I would talk a bit in terminology that was understandable to the Hindu, and they'd say, how do you know that much about our religion? And I said, because I know that much about my own religion, which is Christianity. And that gives me the entry. And this was true if you read, for example, the story of Colonel Olcott's travels, in which everywhere he spoke, it was assumed that he was of that denomination, that he knew it. And it was Theosophy that gave him, of course, the key to it. So I think we have an obligation in a Western country to know truly our Judeo-Christian background and to be familiar with it and its essence. In that regard, then, I really want to start. I've already started, but I want to come now to a quotation. Recently, I have become aware of an organization called the Hermetic Academy. It's a professional society for spiritual and esoteric research. And the head of it, the director of it, is a Professor Kutzinger, who is in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of South Carolina in, of course, the state of South Carolina in the United States. It's a very interesting organization, a society of scholars from a broad range of disciplines, including philosophy, literature, history, and religious studies, aiming to encourage the academic study of spiritual, perennial, and esoteric subjects, and to promote the dissemination and critical evaluation of such research. And at a conference that was held the 1980s, in fact, the very end of last year, December of last year, under the auspices of the American Academy of Religion, one of the speakers was Dr. Houston Smith. And Professor Houston Smith is indeed a very good friend of the Theosophical Society. He has lectured for us at the Crotona School of Theosophy, and is quite a remarkable person. he presented a paper on the topic, "Is there a perennial philosophy?" And I'd just like to quote from his paper, because I think it launches us into this whole thing of Theosophy as a philosophy. He says, "Let us be clear. The perennial philosophy is a philosophy, not a sociology or anthropology that would jump out of the empirical bushes if only we squinted hard enough." The perennialist arrives at the ubiquity of his outlook more deductively than inductively. And that's extremely important, and will be even more so tomorrow when we come to Theosophy as science, because it is the deductive method that characterizes the theosophical approach as science. What Fritz Kuntz, for example, always used to stress, deductive exact science. But we'll talk more about that tomorrow. I don't want to get into it tonight. So the perennialist arrives at the ubiquity of his outlook more deductively than inductively. Indeed he does. So he continues, having encountered a view of things he believes to be true, he concludes that it must be true universally, for truth has ubiquity built into its meaning. And I think that's a very interesting statement, and very much corresponds. I meant to look it up. There's a reference in Volume 1 of the Secret Doctrine, which I meant to look up, in which HPB talks of this very same concept. So, Houston Smith continues, so the unitary truth to which the perennial philosophy points does not depend on the world's religions, but from our side, we are not likely to come upon it, much less keep it in place, save through them. And I think that's a very strong argument, in a sense, for, therefore, recognizing the religious dimension of the Theosophical worldview. He goes on to say, and because I like this, I'd like to quote all of it, if you bear with me. The standard charges against the perennial philosophy are that it devalues matter, history, the human self in both its individual and communal poles, and God's personal aspect. The esoteric denies these charges. We could say Theosophy, the Theosophical worldview, denies these charges. We certainly do not devalue matter. All you have to do is look at letter number 10 in the Mahatma letters. We believe in matter, you see. So one has to understand what is meant by that. Very clearly, one has to probe that. That doesn't mean that the masters are materialists. Far from it. They are not materialists. So there is a very great difference in the statement, we believe in matter, and being a materialist. One has to look at that. So he says the esoteric, or Theosophy, denies these charges. After all, the principle that samsara is nirvana pays the phenomenal world no small compliment. And this, of course, is the great philosophical statement of Nagarjuna, you see, the successor, the interpreter in the 2nd century of the Mahayana Buddhist tradition. Samsara is nirvana, nirvana is samsara, between the two there is no difference, said Nagarjuna. So, the esoteric, to continue with Houston Smith, the esoteric sees nothing in his philosophy to keep him from appreciating the realities in question as much as his exoteric brothers and sisters, while at the same time recognizing that there are things that exceed those admittedly qualified and provisional realities. marvelous statement. And then he concludes it, and I think this is, to me, the capstone of it. Need one be unaware of things better than chocolate to enjoy chocolate as much as a 4-year-old does? Isn't that a marvelous statement?
Incredible.
I think that's marvelous. So that there is, and this, of course, is precisely what Matthew Fox, incidentally, is saying, that there is a rejoicing, a celebration, you see, and that we can celebrate that which is within the realm of our perception, but we don't stop there. We know that there is then that other dimension, a further dimension, that ultimate reality, to which, of course, again, the first fundamental proposition looks, you see. Now, therefore, in approaching the philosophical dimension of the Theosophical worldview, I'd like to point out the 3 major categories of philosophy, and look at these very briefly, and then turn to how we can begin to operate within these. You'll notice, first of all, that in each of these, ontology, epistemology, and axiology, which are the 3 broad categories of philosophical inquiry, that each of them ends in logy, which of course is derived from the Greek term logos. Logos, isn't it? You see? So that we are dealing now with a fundamental ordering principle, which is indeed what logos, usually translated as word. I didn't go into this last night when I put up, word, doctrine, and way of life. But fundamentally, the word logos has often been translated as word. Basically, it means an ordering principle is at work in the universe, in the whole manifested system. This is a universe of order, of design, of plan, if you like, you see. Barborka calls his exposition on the Secret Doctrine the divine plan, that there is a plan, there's a blueprint. Now that does not mean predestination, fate, anything like that, you see. If you've ever built a house, you have an architect's drawings, which you can say, and that becomes the blueprint. But I challenge anyone to find a house that is built exactly according to the architect's blueprint. As one goes along in the building, one makes adjustments. One changes things. One says, that's not going to quite work in that way. And so adaptations are made, do you see? But the blueprint gives the general outline, doesn't it? Do you see? So what logos refers to is the ordering principle. And this is a fundamental concept of the Theosophical worldview. It is not a random throwing out of anything, you see. There is an order, a fundamental ordering principle, which is innate in us, too. Sometimes gets us into trouble. The mind, for example. Our minds want to classify, to organize. We want to know what this is, you see. And we feel then we can stash it away. If you meet this sort of thing for the first time and you say, what is that? And Gay says, that's a chair. Then you say, aha, now I know what it is, you see. And I classify it and I put it away. And I add it to all the other chairs that I have ever seen, you see. And now I've got one more sort of thing. And we're all the time doing this, aren't we? You see, if we went around, I've often said, if we went around the world simply like a batch of cattle, although some people seem to take that kind of attitude towards the world, licking everything, you see, tasting everything. you see, we might number everything. This is number 1, this is number 2, the chair is number 3, you see. And then we would have, you know, each item would have its own number. You begin to feel we're moving towards that with all the numbers we have to remember, you know, social security and zip codes and telephone numbers and credit card numbers and so on. We probably will be born in the next incarnation, I am quite sure, not be given a name but simply a number, you know. Maybe the Lords of Karma will stamp a number, sort of. We'll come out already stamped with the number that is ours. Yes, across the forehead. There it will be. You know. You can just see it. But we don't do that, you see. And so if I say to you, for example, will you draw me a chair? I probably will have any number of different chairs when I collect the papers. But we all recognize that each one is a legitimate one of these units. So there is an ordering principle, a classifying principle, if you like, an ordering principle within us. It's inherent in the universe, inherent in consciousness. And this is very much pointed to again in the Secret Doctrine. HPB says there are 2 ones, the one beyond all manifestation, which can do nothing, and the one on the plane of manifestation, that from which is Ishvara or Logos, she says. That is, it is creative, but it is creative in accordance with design, with order, with an ordering principle, fundamental. And that is pointed to, above all, as part of this whole general area that we call philosophy. Everything in philosophy is in accordance with an ordering principle. I often think, many years ago at Wheaton, I was given a lovely little glass animal. It didn't look like any animal that had ever roamed the wild or ever been tamed, but you knew it was an animal. So people would come into my room and say, "What is that?" And so I'd say, "Well, that's a Theozoa." You see, it's one of my made-up, you see.
Does it perflink?
I'm not sure whether it perflinked or not, but everybody was satisfied, you see, because I'd given it a kind of classification. It was a Theozoa. I thought it was a marvelous name, you see. It's a theosophical animal.
Yes.
You see. Well, this ordering principle is fundamental. If we are to come, you see, Philos, this is Philos, and Sophos is the basis of Sophia, or Sophie there, which is that wisdom in, let me just take a moment going back from Logos to this, because it is Logos that leads us to this. It is the ordering principle that leads us to this. And what is this wisdom nature, this original consciousness, if you like? I'm interested that Matthew Fox calls it original blessing, because it is a blessing. It is a grace that is given, if you like, you see. But it is the original knowingness is Sophos, is wisdom. It is the complete knowing in which one is that which one knows. There is no longer any separation. There is no longer knower and known. There is no separation. But that is in a particular relationship. And it's very interesting. Now, in English, we have only one word for love, you know, and you can love apple pie, or you can love your husband and wife, or you can love your children, or you can, you know, love rain or sunshine, and we still say love, don't we? And yet, I'm sure that you don't love your husband or wife in the same way you may love apple pie. You may, but I don't think so. You know, I mean, there's a different quality, isn't there? Now, the Greeks, of course, knew this, And indeed, in most philosophical languages, English is a commercial language. It's not necessarily a very philosophical language. It's a commercial language. It's the language of world trade, you see. It is a commercial language, basically, not a philosophical language. And so Greek, of course, had several different words for love, including agape, which was the highest form in which love could manifest. This, of course, is very much pointed up in the Christian scripture. You remember Jesus asks Peter, "Do you love me?" And he answers yes, and then he says, "Do you love me?" Yes, and "Do you love me?" yet a third time. Now in the Greek, those are three different words. In English, it sounds like Jesus didn't hear him very well the first time. You see. But in the Greek, in the original Greek, it's three different terms. But there is no other way to translate it into English without getting a convoluted phrase and, a lengthy explanation. You see, do you reverence me as that which is the ultimate reality? Do you respect me as that which is a recognition of our equality, of our moving together? And the final, do you love me? Do you care for me as you care for all creatures? Do you find that I am in everything, and therefore you care for all? And there are three different levels, you see, in the Greek. Now this level, which gives us indeed the word, well, the easiest is filial, which you all know. Brotherly, you see. So this is at an equal level. That is to say, it is that wisdom which is ours by our own nature, because we are rooted in that ultimate reality. There is no other. Do you see the meaning? Now it was, of course, Pythagoras who first used the word philosophy in the Western world, and of course the word philosophy is Greek in origin, as I've just pointed out, and it was the great towering figure of Western philosophy, Pythagoras, who indeed introduced the word. And Pythagoras, of course, established a school, and it was a school that had in it a great number of disciplines: music, geometry, mathematics, geography, a great number of disciplines, including the fact of 7 years of silence. Imagine having a school, 7 years of silence. And that school, of course, was in southern Italy, and it was named Crotona. And it is after that school, of course, of Pythagoras, that the Crotona Institute, the Crotona School of Theosophy, which I direct, was named. Not that I impose 7 years of silence on my students, and I don't mean to strike all of you dumb by this, but rather that this was indeed the whole aim of the Pythagorean school, was to bring about the asking of the question that would lead to that relationship with an ultimate reality in which all, as we said last night, the self simply isn't there. It's not that one has killed out the self. The self is simply not there because one has entered into a relationship as an equal with knowledge, with wisdom. Do you see? Now, to achieve that, then, therefore, as the possibility, we have logos. So, each of these three areas is a particular ordering principle. Ontology, then, is the theory of reality. I'll continue to use red, if that's all right. Everything else must be based on the theory of reality. The word, of course, ontology comes from on, which means being. So it's the theory of beingness or being, you see. That is, it's the whole science, the ordering of what is the ultimate. And that's why that must come first. As we'll look at the Theosophical worldview in a moment, we'll begin to see how basic this is. This is, of course, in the first fundamental proposition, isn't it? Our theory of reality, our view. And from that, because of that, all else flows. Everything else flows. For the Theosophical worldview, let me just put it very simply, the Theosophical worldview is non-dualism. I'll come back to that when we get on to another sheet, but just to finish that, we'll put it there at the moment. Epistemology, then, that means, you see, if there is no duality, there is no separation, mind and matter, let us say, no separation, there is only one ultimate reality, then what is the theory of cognition, the theory of knowing? From, of course, episteme is the Greek word simply for knowledge. So this is very simple. What is then the theory of cognition? I'm sorry, I sort of ran off there. Didn't write it very plainly. But it's the theory of how do we know? How do we know? This is the central question here. Now, how we know is based on our theory of reality. And we'll see that in a little moment. Axiology, then, flows from that. And this is very, very important because this is the theory of values. From the word axio, which means worthy. What is worthy? Or Plato would have said, what is the good? We can develop this along Platonic lines if you like, but I really wasn't going to do that, I think. So here are the three great areas. Now let us then look further for a moment. Still I'm going to get you involved in a moment. That we have to take off for the present. Everyone has a way of looking at the world. We all look at the world in a certain way. And so a worldview involves really two aspects. And so when we talk about the Theosophical worldview, we're talking about a theoria, to use the Greek term, to use the Sanskrit term, a darshan. This is a way of looking at the world, a mode of seeing, of comprehending the world. Not just physical seeing, but it's a way in which we perceive everything. And that, of course, is going to be based on our ontology, on our theory of reality, which leads us to how we know the world, do you see? Often people go the other way around. Theosophically, we do not. The other is the practica, or the praxis, to use the Greek. That is to say, a mode of action which results from the way in which we perceive the world, we look at the world. So everyone has, just as I suggested last night, everyone has a faith, everyone has then a worldview, because we perceive the universe, ourselves, everything in it, in some manner. And in accordance with that perception, we act out what we believe. We really do. We act out what we believe. And how we view ourselves, how we view others, how we treat the world about us, you know, how we treat the earth, how we treat trees and birds and animals, how we treat flowers and grass, all of that, as well as other people, how we treat ideas, all of that flows from our mode of seeing the world, and that gives rise to our mode of knowing the world, epistemology. The three are very much, therefore, intertwined. Now, this particular worldview, this particular mode of viewing that we're talking about, the Theosophical worldview, is a particular worldview. And perhaps we can best look at it from the point of view of what I call, choosing your metaphysic. Oversimplifying, we can begin to, as it were, look at several different metaphysical positions. I like red and black. It looks rather nice together, doesn't it? If this is color TV, we have to have some color in that. In each of these theorias, or darshans, there is implicit, then, a worldview, a way of acting, a way of being in the world. And generally it is suggested that there are three metaphysical positions, but I suggest Theosophy is a kind of fourth metaphysical position. And so I call them M1, M2, M3, and M4. It's a nice way to abbreviate it. So Metaphysic 1, according to this worldview, the basic stuff of the universe is matter-energy. We learn about reality. The only way we can know epistemology about reality is whether something is measurable, whether it's quantifiable, you see. And that's the only way, and our only way of knowing of epistemology is through the physical senses, or the extensions of the physical senses. And all scientific equipment are merely extensions of the physical senses. We've extended our eyes into the very small through microscopes, into the very large through telescopes. We've extended our ears through radar and sonar and so on, you see. Everything is an extension of our senses. And we now have instruments that we manipulate that can put a hand in and do various things and so on, and we say we haven't touched it. Of course we've touched it. We haven't touched it with this physical hand, but it's an extension of our hand that has touched it, and so on, an extension of our brains. The computer is but an extension of the circuitry of the brain, isn't it? Tremendously. I mean, we all have these little crystal chips in our heads. Sometimes we carry the chips on our shoulders, but it's just the same thing. So this is, of course, the positivist assumption that the only way we can learn is through the physical senses and their extensions. Whatever consciousness is, it emerges out of matter. And when the evolutionary process has reached a certain point, whatever we can learn, we get from studying the physical brain. And if we study enough of the physical brain, we think we'll identify mind. And this is one of the great, subjects of research today, the brain-mind research. That if you study enough about the structure, the chemical structure of the brain, you know all the chemicals that are there, or lack of chemicals. If you know all about the synapses, you see, all of that, then you will have identified the mind. Ha-ha! Something eludes it always, doesn't it, you see. So M1 is, we can call materialistic monism. And this, of course, has dominated the Western world of science. Someone has written a creed based on materialistic monism, which I like very much. You see, mind and consciousness are just the software of the brain. You see, they're the floppy disks of the brain, if you like. You see, and they cease to exist when the brain decays. So someone has written this, a Western creed based on this. 1, I believe in the material universe as the only and ultimate reality, a universe therefore controlled by fixed physical laws and blind chance. Secondly, I affirm that the universe has no creator, no objective purpose, and no objective meaning or destiny. Third, I maintain that my life and my consciousness have no objective purpose, meaning, or destiny. 4, I believe that all judgments, values, and moralities, whether my own or others, are subjective, arising solely from biological determinants, personal history, and chance. So there are people who follow that affirmation. Now, an alternative metaphysic is, of course, dualistic. It proposes 2 fundamentally different kinds of stuff: matter-energy stuff, mind-spirit stuff. And never the twain shall meet. There are 2 tracks. That there are 2 complementary kinds of knowledge, then. There's inner subjective knowledge, all right, and there is outer hard fact, objective knowledge. And so that leads, from that epistemology, it leads back to this metaphysic simply of dualism. And this, of course, has dominated Western science, these 2, but particularly dualism since the time of Descartes, Cartesian philosophy, that said there are 2 tracks, mind, matter. They run parallel perhaps, but they will never meet however far you go. There is, of course, some kind of overlapping that has troubled much of science. Field of psychic phenomena, for example, which really, sort of overlaps, where the track of mind got involved with the track of matter, or the track of matter sort of crossed the track of mind. And so that is having some difficulty. Now, the third metaphysic that has come about, that is has always been present, but is being somewhat revived today, finds the ultimate stuff of the universe to be consciousness. The ultimate stuff of the universe is consciousness. Guess I should wait, shouldn't I? All right. Ultimately, reality is contacted not through the physical senses, but through intuition. The physical world is simply a dream. You see. You remember that wonderful passage in Alice in Wonderland, for example. She's out walking with the Red Queen, and she meets Tweedledum and Tweedledee, which, of course, these are representative of the higher and lower aspects of Monas, Tweedledum and Tweedledee. And so they say to her, she comes upon the Red Queen who is snoring, and they say to her, don't wake her, because you're only a thing in her dream. You see, and so there is this concept that this is all a dream. Consciousness is not the end product of material evolution, but it came first and is only that. And so sometimes this is usually called transcendental monism. And can be, you see the difference between materialistic monism and transcendental monism. Here, everything is indeed hard, fast, objective reality. Matter is, what we perceive, what we knock our shins into. It's the furniture of the world that we stumble over. Here, that doesn't exist. It's non-existent. All that exists is consciousness. Now, I suggest that really we have to put this right. We have to bring back a balance and see really that there is a fourth metaphysic, which Theosophy suggests, which I think is non-dualism. Sorry, seem to not be able to make my letters very well. It'll ruin the camera for sure. Or Advaita, from the Sanskrit a, not, dva, two. Not two. So that there is now a recognition in this that some of this is true, and so the master can say, we believe in matter, and some of this is true because what is matter is consciousness expressing itself at whatever level of manifestation we are concerned with. Do you see? So some of this is true, some of this is true. What is not true about this is the separation. Do you see? So the more appropriate term for theosophy is not monism, but non-dualism. It is a dialectic, if you like. It is not a duality, but a dialectic, in which, as H.P.B. says, there cannot be spirit without matter or matter without spirit. There's a very fine book that was originally in French. The author is a nuclear research physicist in France, Jean Charon, and I can't give you the title of the book in French because I don't remember it, but it has recently been translated into English. I find it's available only in England. I can't get it in the United States, but it's a fascinating book called The Unknown Spirit. I reviewed it, and the review appears in the last issue, the August issue of the Theosophist, the international journal, in which here is a nuclear physicist who proposes that the unknown spirit, the spiritual aspect, the interior guiding, teleological, if you like, purposeful, in other words, aspect, and I didn't put teleology because teleology is part of ontology, really. The teleological aspect of all matter is in the electron, the bearer of spirit, he calls it. And it's rather interesting, and he has all kinds of proofs from physics, you know, with formulae and mathematical proof and so on. Very interesting, though. But here is a leading nuclear research physicist coming out with the fact that the unknown spirit is the electron, that it is a kind of, this is that which gives order to all combinations, atomic and finally molecular and organic and on, you see, so on. But fundamentally then, this position that is the Theosophical worldview is non-dualistic. Now how do we then enter into this particular mode of knowing that utilizes this? Well, I'm going to skip some things because I want to come rather quickly to, oh dear, I've talked far too long. I'm sorry about that. Be patient and bear with me for a little while longer. You don't want to go out in the rain anyway, do you? You may want your cups of tea, but you don't. 9, Joy. Oh, good. All right. I have till 9. Very good. Now, coming back to Pythagoras, with that little interlude, but keeping that in mind, that we are a non-dualistic in which there is a dialectic, not a dichotomy, not a dualism, not mind, not matter and spirit, but spirit matter, matter spirit, you see, H.P.B. talks about this. You cannot have one without the other, and it's a dialectic, it's a polarization that takes place, do you see? Coming back, keeping that in mind, I want to return a moment to Pythagoras, because actually what Pythagoras was saying is that there are two kinds of ideas in this, so that the theoria, I'm going to put this on again, the way of seeing is the praxis. the same as. And this is, I suggest, the central lesson of the Secret Doctrine, of the Theosophical worldview. Simply stated, live the life if you would come to the wisdom. The theory, the darshan, the view is the practical, the way of conduct, the mode of action. So what is worthy, the axiology, which is the ethics, what is good, one's ethics, depend on what one knows, the mode of one's knowing, epistemology, depends upon one's ontology. Do you see how interlinked these are? And this was true for Pythagoras. And so Pythagoras distinguished between two fundamental kinds of ideas, two fundamental types of ideas. The first type, he said, are a sort of energy. And again, I was very much interested, as an aside, in the fact that Matthew Fox begins his whole thesis, the first theme of his first path is he uses a Hebrew word, which is found, of course, in the Hebrew scriptures. And it's a very interesting word that you may not be familiar with. The word is dabhar, which is an energy that inherent in the universe, primary, are principles which have within them their own energy. People at Crotona would say, ha, we knew that ultimately Joy would get Fohat in somehow, because Fohat is my favorite character in the Secret Doctrine. Of all the characters that go through those pages, my favorite one is Fohat. Marvelous character, also known as Eros, a.k.a. you see, also known as, you see these aliases. Well, Fohat has a lot of aliases, among which is Eros, you see, as HPB says. So, fundamental are those great ideas which contain within them a kind of energy, dabhar in the Hebrew, a kind of dynamism, fohat, which is the dynamism of the universe, that which propels into all activity. And so according to Pythagoras, this energy in the scriptures of the world, the ancient language, was always called the spiritual food. One finds this in the Vedas, the most ancient of all scriptures, for example. These great ideas, personified often as aspects of the creative power, you see, often personified as Agni, Varuna, and so on, all of the hierarchy of the gods, the marvelous hierarchy, the ordering of the gods, as the spiritual food, which they assimilated, do you see? Which, of course, just like calories give us energy, you see, gave the gods, gave these primal ideas energy, because they are this energy. And the verbal formulation is just one aspect, therefore, that these are, therefore, what I call the great principles. First of all, we have, because one has to call them something, principles or ideas. Not bad, is it? Huh. Now the second type of ideas, the first type are principles, therefore, which have an energy in them, which move, which have a dynamism in them. The second kind we can call concepts. They are derived from these primary principles. They are concepts. They are verbal formulations which can be communicated, messages from one intellect to another. And so, to be understood, they require the analytical and combinatory powers of mentation, cognition. Concepts are, so to speak, problem-solving devices. They're the internal mental equivalent of technologies, if you like. Concepts are the technologies of the mind machine, you see. So these concepts can never reach beyond the level of their own nature. They are static. And what happens is that we often become stuck in these concepts, you see, and do not return to the principles from which they're derived. But concepts do, however, express themselves in modes, modalities of action, if you like. They express themselves in values, then, which I call modalities of being in the world. If I respect you, you see, if I recognize that you are indeed but a mirror image of myself, that we are both rooted in that same ultimate reality, then my value of you is what Martin Buber called the I-thou relationship. But if I see, if my concept, for example, is that I am separate, and you're there standing in my way, you're not permitting me to be what I want to be, then I exploit you, or I kill you, or I, step on you, I do whatever I can, get you out of my way, and Martin Buber calls this the I-it relationship. You become an it instead of a thou. And part of our problem today of the world is that we have reified, made it, not only of other people, but of trees and animals and the earth itself. We've made it an it, to be exploited, to be used. It's there, you see. The word dominion has crept in to the translation of the Hebrew text in Genesis. And it was not dominion, but rather the Hebrew was that man shall have care for, not dominion over, but should have care for. He is responsible for all of life. But instead of that, it's been translated in the fall redemption theology as dominion. And therefore, I can do as I will because I'm king. You see, out with you, off with your head, you see. Kill the animals, pollute the lakes, pollute the air, take up all the oil. Who cares what happens, to a next generation? Just, one life, so what does it matter? And so on, you see. So it's reified, it's been made an it, because we think we have dominion. Rather, what was the Hebrew word was given responsibility for. He is to be as a king is to his people, gracious, kindly, concerned. That was all there in the Hebrew word, you see. And you see how we've misinterpreted a lot of this. So here is where I'd like to elicit your thought, for example. Let us say that a primary principle of the Theosophical philosophy, one of the great principles of the Theosophical philosophy then, based on this concept of one ultimate reality, an absolute beyond all knowability, that the manifesting process is a process of polarization, not duality. Polarization, a dialectic is established. As I say, spirit matter. All right, what concepts do you think flow from that? Think about it for a moment. What concepts flow from that?
Joy is still a concept.
No, I'm talking about it as a fundamental ordering principle.
It's still a concept. That's the way you conceive something.
Well, yes, but I'm looking at it now from the point of view that within this process of polarization, if you like, is its own dynamism.
Are we talking about an understanding here or a belief now?
Whichever you want.
Well, there's a vast difference between the two, of course.
Well, it may only be a belief for you.
Yeah, it has to be an understanding. That's why I think there has to be a relationship of knowing and exploring and having that relationship with people, which is very dynamic. And by doing this and having this honest understanding of this receptivity and this relationship, we do not have the I-it, we have the I-thou.
I-thou. All right. Well,
concept
I'm still having to use words.
Yes, of course.
So I'm still having to use words. Well, let me suggest to you that the concepts that flow from that indicate not an either-or situation, but a both-and, good, evil, man, woman. Not either-or, but a polarization, a complementarity. In which
Interdependence?
Interdependence, you see. All of those which flow from that primary principle. You begin to see what happens. Now, what values, then, are going to result from those concepts?
Makes you think.
Hmm?
Makes you think, certainly.
All right, but it does more than that. What are the values,
You
then?
start to do something about what
You start to do something about it, you see. Let us say that one of the fundamental principles, again, from this original, this ontology of an ultimate source, is periodicity. This, of course, is the second fundamental proposition of the Secret Doctrine. What concepts, then, come from this great fundamental principle? Well, one that's certainly basic concept that we always think of in Theosophy. What is that? Isn't it reincarnation?
or the flood or anything else.
Well, from the point of view of, I'm just using the term periodicity, but reincarnation, metempsychosis. This is as it applies to the individual. We have the concepts of rounds, races, and so on, don't we? Planetary chains. All of that. These are concepts which flow from this fundamental principle which has in it, which is the second fundamental principle.
Could we put cycles in there too?
We can, all cycles, yes, all cycles, you see. And therefore, what values now flow from it? Think about it for a moment. What values now flow from this? Can you be unmindful of future generations?
You are future generations.
Because we are our own future, as we are our own past. So if we destroy the earth, we've destroyed ourselves, our own living place, not for our grandchildren or great-grandchildren and so on, but for ourselves. So what kind of ethic is involved, you see?
All life is precious.
All life is precious, isn't it, you see? Let us say that a third one is what I call lawfulness. You may want to call it by other names, but I'd like to call it lawfulness. That a great fundamental principle is, and this is also in the second fundamental principle, but also proposition, but also it's in the third fundamental proposition. A lawfulness that is present throughout the system. So what concepts flow from that? Well, quite obviously karma, dharma, and many others, you see. Order, justice, and so on. Isn't that right? Begin to
Balance and
balance and harmony, you see? And so what values now come from it, you see? There are other very, very great principles that are inherent. One is the principle, I often put order down here, but I don't know if you'll agree. I think a fundamental principle which HPB points to in the Secret Doctrine, she says on an understanding of it, an understanding of the whole system emerges, which means within it is a great power, a great dynamism, is the principle of number, which, you see, can lead to order, or can lead to it can lead to harmony, beauty, proportion, right proportion, which gives a number of values, you see, the values of the beautiful. And so one can go on. You can list any number of them that you will, you see. Principle of hierarchy, you see. All of this. So one can begin to see what are those fundamental propositions that derive from this non-dualistic philosophy, which have in them their own dynamism, their own dabhar, their own energy, which is in Sanskrit fohat, or not in Sanskrit, and she says it's a Tibetan term, but nobody's ever found it in a Tibetan dictionary, interestingly enough, so it must have been used in some of the mystery schools, some of the secret schools in which she was a student in Tibet, because it's not an ordinary Tibetan word. It's not in any Tibetan dictionary, interestingly. So it must have been used in the secret mystery schools, and undoubtedly with that she was giving us then a key to some of the great mysteries.
Could it have been Pali?
No, it's not Pali. It's not in any known language.
Could HPB have made a mistake? Is that
That's possible. It's also possible that of course the masters use the term also, and it's quite possible that in the transliteration from the original Tibetan, that you see that it got twisted in some way. But I think she used it for a special purpose, and I think it undoubtedly was a term that she learned in her own training in Tibet. Because there is a mystery language, of course. We know that.
Using a lot of what you just said,
Mhm.
but not using forehead now.
Mhm.
Physicist terms.
Oh, yes.
Energy, all of this.
Yes, pure energy. Yes, all of that. But these are principles which she sets forth, and you can go through the Secret Doctrine, for example, and pick out those principles which have their own dynamism, their own energy, their own ordering possibility. Because it's the dynamism of ordering process, you see. And then see what concepts derive, and then what values derive. And that then gives us, based on our ontology, our mode of knowing opens to us through concepts, through the conceptual knowing. Our mode of knowing, but it's rooted in that universal one source. And then our axiology, our value system, our ethics flow inevitably from those. So live the life if you would come to the wisdom. Well, I think we ought to have a little time for some discussion or questions or points you want to raise. But that, as I see it, is Theosophy as philosophy. Not often, perhaps, approached from that point of view. In fact, I don't know anyone else who's done this. Which is why I decided it had to be done.
Long overdue, Joy.
Yes. Well, I decided it had to be done because nobody else had done it. And so when I see something no one else has done and I feel it needs to be done, well, then I think...
That cuts off the questions, too, doesn't it?
Yes.
Most of us have never seen this before.
No, I'm sure you haven't.
No.
It's something I've been working with for some time, trying to develop. I personally list 6 here, because I'm convinced that the system is not a 7-fold, but it's a 1 and a 6. Because that's what gave me the clue to that was a very interesting quest book called Atoms, Snowflakes, and God. And the primary atomic structure, the hydrogen atom, is 6-fold. It's octagonal. Yeah, a hydrogen atom is octagonal. Hexagonal. Hexagonal, 6-fold, hexagonal. The basic structure of the snowflake is also 6. The God images that Jung has discovered were all hexagonal, which is interesting. And it seems to me that this comes back to this dynamism of the idea of number, the principle of number, which she points to. Because, as I've commented, there are different ways of counting. And among the primitives, the way of counting, you see, was not 1, 2, 3, as we do, you see, in which we have separate objects and we number them. You know, I have 10 apples and we've counted them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, sort of thing. But 2 is the 2-ness of 1. 3 is the 3-ness of 1. 4 is the 4-ness of 1. Because there is only one. There is only one. And in a unitary system, a non-dualistic system such as Theosophy, that is the way we have to learn to count. And you see what that does? To a whole new concept. Yeah, you see. Because everything is only the ness of 1, the 2-ness, 3-ness, 4-ness. It's the nessness of 1. You see. And what does that do to your value system? Puts it on a head, doesn't it? You see. Really does. It turns it upside down. So I have 6 here, but I'll leave you to discover what are your numbers, what numbering you have for the principles. And where you fit in concepts. Now you see, in this, for example, it's no longer, for example, with here, it's not either or. It's both and. A dialectic is established.
That's the way we look at it, isn't it?
Yes, it's both and. And we've always said you have to either be good or bad. Good and evil. It's not good or evil, but you see, both are necessary in a manifested system. Nirvana is samsara, and samsara is nirvana. Between the two there is no difference. What a remarkable statement. So the universe is not just a dream. We've used the term Maya, and HPB, of course, constantly translates it as illusion. But what she's saying is, because an illusion does not mean it doesn't exist. And of course, the famous analogy in Advaita Vedanta is the snake and rope, you know. The man who sees an object lying in the road at twilight and assumes it's a snake and jumps back in terror and approaches and, of course, finds it's a rope. Now, the fact that it was a rope and not a snake does not mean it was an illusion. That is to say, something was there, but what was there was not what he thought was there. And the other famous analogy is the horns of the hare, which I've always loved. That seeing a hare, a rabbit, at twilight, one thinks it has horns. And of course, you know that hares do not have horns. But you see it that way. And that's how we view the world. We constantly view it.
They claim they do in Wyoming.
Well, that's possible in Wyoming. I would think anything is possible in Wyoming. I think that's
They do sell them, though, in all the stores.
yeah.
Joy, the word Maya's often come up, and it's always been associated with the cosmos.
Yes.
I don't know why, but isn't really a lot of Maya really to do with us, the way we view things?
It is, but Maya is a Shakti. Maya is energy. It's the same word we have in magic, you know, magi. And the wise men were known as the magi because they were masters of this magic. They were masters of this Shakti, or power, or dynamism. And it is indeed the consort of the highest. It's the consort of Shiva, is Maya in Hindu mythology. And of course the root of the word Maya is ma, to measure. It's metro. It's the metron, you see. And we are the measure, and as well as the measurer. So it's the approximation. It's the mistaking of the approximation for the actual, or it's the mistaking of what one sees. You see, it's like, again, coming back to panentheism, that God is in everything, but that doesn't mean that everything is God. But the principle is present in everything, cannot be separated from.
This, we were talking coming over, remember, about Yogananda?
Yes.
Well, he was a man who could size up in an audience those that were coming near spiritualism, those that had to wait.
Yes.
And there's been theosophical people that could do that. Not Krishnamurti, but the other, Krishnamurti.
Krishnamurti, I think Krishnamurti
He could tell which was the people in an audience which
who
were
could
coming near, and others which would have to wait a while.
That's right.
And Theosophy must have, as far as its height of going on the books we can read and understand, must have some plan whereby we'll be brought up until we can all get this kind of thing. It'll be almost as natural to us as what we now know. Our concept will change.
You see, I think another one of these great principles is hierarchy. But hierarchy not necessarily just in a ladder formation, but hierarchy in the general systems theory concept of it, in which there is a functional growth, you see. Often we think of hierarchy as sort of stepping up a ladder, you see. But in general systems theory, the word is used. For example, every cell in your body is perfectly organized for what it's doing, marvelously organized for what it's doing. And it has its own inherent mechanism, its own inherent nature, doesn't it? When it's grouped with other cells, it forms an organ. Now, the organ has characteristics added which are not part of any of the cells which compose it. New characteristics emerge at each level of organization, in other words, you see. So if the cell is a cell in the liver, for example, the organ that we call the liver is not just a addition of a group of cells. It's greater than the sum of its parts, isn't it? Do you see? New characteristics emerge. Now, when the organ is part of the whole body, yet you see, we're not just made up of, the liver, the spleen, the heart, and the lungs, and, we're not just a kind of put-together machine, but something else emerges. And so there is the hierarchy of the body. But at each level, there is an organization which is functionally adequate. But it doesn't mean that when you come to the body, the organ has been dispensed with. When you come to the organ, the cell no longer exists.
Well, there's a couple of us here who have been in Theosophy for over 40 years. And looking back to the early years and seeing young members come in, the one thing they do, of course, is ask questions.
Yes.
And very often the question they ask, they better wait for getting the answer. I've
Yes.
put that out many times.
I think you're absolutely right,
Because,
BJ.
most of the things that I know, or feel I know, and have some concept of truth in them,
Mm-hmm.
are those things no one told me I didn't even read.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like that kind of a point to be in everyone's mind as here tonight.
Mm-hmm.
They're not overlooked.
Yes,
And
that's
you don't
right.
have to grab and grasp and
Yes.
go
That's
crazy.
right.
Just do a little waiting.
Wait. Mm-hmm.
Because one of these days,
Mm-hmm.
you'll be able to see and hear.
Mhm.
You can't do either until you can do both.
Till you do both. Yes.
Now you know what I'm talking about.
I do. Yes, I
Because
do.
you wouldn't be putting this on the screen and talking to us unless you had something
Mhm.
of that character right
Mhm.
now,
Mhm.
after your years of study.
Yes.
It's bound to come.
Mm-hmm. It's bound to.
So
Yes.
that seems to me to be the encouraging thing about what
Yes,
you put on here
that's right.
tonight.
Mm-hmm.
We can't carry it away.
No.
It'll be ours.
Yes. That's
sometime.
right. We begin to look at it, and this is perhaps just a new way of expressing it.
Yeah.
But it's there. So, all right, a cup of tea, I guess everybody's ready for. But in any event, this is a new way, perhaps. Yes, I thank you for that, BJ, very much.